So let's move on and this time look at the class constructor for our panel, JPanel derived class. And it seems to be doing quite a bit of work. I mean, in fact, it does, almost like half of everything that this class does. So here's the constructor. Just a reminder that when we went to the initial setup code, what happens was that we actually do create a group of radio buttons, and therefore this constructor is executed early on. So early on it gets executed. By the way, the constructor here gets a reference to our frame, to our window, and we immediately remember it in our member reference to the frame. That's okay, but then we do something else early on. We create a listener for radio buttons. So in order for us to sync in those events, those clicks, and other types of notification, in this specific sample, we seem to have a dedicated class which becomes a listener on the events that happened on our buttons. So let's take a look at the listener, since it kind of came up into view. All right, so the group radio listener class is an example of a class which implements action listener. If you recall, prior to this point, what we've used for putting together some code that handles user actions, it was the action listener class, but it was created as an anonymous class, an anonymous object which overrides the run method and does something. This time we have a dedicated class which is not an anonymous class, just a normal class, and we say we would like to have an object which implements action listener, and guess what? It has access to the group of radio buttons, which is our panel derived class, and here's the constructor. So the constructor simply remembers what is the group of buttons is, right? So it just remembers that, and when the user clicks, right, which generates, so the default click event is so the default click event essentially calls an action performed method inside the action listener public interface, right? So of course here we implement it, and what we do is that we grab the event, and the event tells us the details about the click, but we delegate this action performed to the action performed which is built into our group of the radio buttons. And of course the group of radio buttons is right here. It's this class, and let's see if it has action performed. Yes, it does. So this is who or which method that receives the actual event. And unfortunately, this is a bit of a lengthier code that I would prefer it to be. But what it does is this. So remember, when I run this, just to demonstrate it one more time. All right. So when I run this, and I have this this window, right? I can even try resizing it to make everything visible. So when I make clicks that go, here from one radio button to another, when I click those radio buttons, so the listener gets the notification, because apparently we're going to attach that listener, and the name of the listener is group radio buttons listener, right? It gets notifications, but instantly delegates those notifications to the class name group radio buttons. And specifically, there's a method called action performed, and it receives the event generated as a result of the click. And look what we do. We can tell the event what is your source, and it gives us back an object, Remember, in Java, every class derives itself from the object class, and that's what getSource returns back. The next thing that happens is that we can compare memory locations. We compare object with the radio button, which is called radio green, then radio blue, and orange, right? And then in order to indicate that we properly got notified by those events, what we do is that we click these buttons, and you should notice how the title bar of my entire form actually changes as soon as I click, right? So besides rearranging the selection of the radio button, what you can see is that the title bar changes, and this is the demonstration here, is that we can use our frame reference to tell the frame that your new title should be, you know, this, and that. So you can see that this if-else statement is executed when I click on different options over there, right? So all of the user interface requires this kind or similar kind of plumbing, and that plumbing is kind of simplified when you use NetBeans Designer, because usually you just choose to implement action performed, and it'll give you a placeholder for that kind of code. But if you write it from scratch, you need to write from scratch many of these methods, and these methods would, as an example, contain some of this or similar code. Okay, so although not much interesting is happening as a result of these radio button selections, we demonstrate that it's possible to very successfully receive event notifications from every click on the radio button, right? So except of changing the title bar on the form, there's really nothing taking place. Not much more than that is really happening, and that's just a demo code for how to get an action listener in place and getting invoked, and then how do you determine which of the buttons was clicked. And you can do this by simply comparing the memory addresses of these objects to determine something like that. All right, so I'm going to close this form again and move on, or rather move back onto the constructor, because we just scratched the surface of this constructor for the group of the radio buttons, and we just explored what this listener does and how it delegates and dispatches the calls from the system to the action perform handler, which could use something specific based on these clicks. Okay, moving on. Then remember, we discussed this button group helper object, which allows us to appropriately make selections of groups, of button groups. And you can experiment with this by simply creating new project, okay? Creating new form, and just placing a couple of buttons on that form. And if you do that, you'll realize that their behavior is not very intelligent. To make that an appropriate and well-behaved arrangement, you need to have this group button helper object, and it comes in the form of the button group. So we just create this group, and we remember that group. There's a reference inside this this class to remember the button group object in memory. The next thing that we do, we proceed to create the actual buttons. So the radio buttons are instantiated or created as JRadio buttons, and they do accept the title. And of course, the title, as you notice, by default appears on the right-hand side next to the selector, like which makes an impression on the user side that we have a bullet list and we can make selection based on that bullet. I also set mnemonics And if you do add mnemonics to your controls, and this can be done with other controls, not specifically just the radio buttons, but you can specify the key shortcuts. And you can see that I'm trying to make these radio buttons available through the key shortcuts such as Control G, Control B, Control O, and also Alt O, B, and G. Right, so you can do this as well. Interestingly, the radio button has this another interesting feature that it can remember. It can just remember a string which uniquely identifies internally, uniquely identifies that specific button. And it's done through this set action command, which actually takes the object, and this is basically like a parameter that can be returned back by the button when it's clicked. Also, when you populate a form with the list of buttons, we're talking about radio buttons this time, one of them, I think it's natural type of thing to present one of them being selected by default, or if these buttons represent a unique multi-choice setting, then of course you may want to select the one that you just loaded from the database to be the one that's selected. Okay, but here in my sample, what I do, I just set one of them to be selected, and it just happens to be the one at the top, just to make it look good. All right, so similar work is done with the blue and with the orange button when we create those, and then we say that this button group object that we created, the group object, we tell the group, remember these three buttons. Basically, we execute the code by using the add method of the button group, and tell that button group, you should remember that you will be managing the three buttons, and this is who this button group object, this is who takes care of appropriate selections and deselections of buttons at runtime. We don't have to write any other code rather than making sure that we create the button group and we make it aware of the group of radio buttons that we have, and that's all it takes, right? So this is how you keep. This is how you tell buttons that you're not something complete. You don't exist in isolation. You have sibling controls which are very much like you are, and you will be managed by that button group. Okay, enough said. Moving on. Then we say a register action listener for radio buttons, and if you recall, the radio button listener that we already discussed needs to be added individually to each button. Okay, and so we tell each button, green, blue, and orange, your listener is, and we tell who that is, and as long as that object has action performed, method overloaded, the button will notify that object with an appropriate information at the appropriate time when the user makes their clicks or uses other means to modify or access that control or button or scroll bar or whatever we're trying to add this listener onto. Okay, so we discussed already the layout, and another instance of using grid layout is in the constructor of the group of the radio buttons, and this is where we create another layout. This time we create basically a one column grid, and we say there's like 0 rows and 1 column. It's basically, you can exclude rows from the grid layout, which is kind of counterintuitive, but you can exclude the rows, and you can say, I just want to have 1 column and multiple columns, and it'll create this grid layout, and we simply add this, and the result of it, you can see that when we populate these buttons and display, they're all arranged in like vertical arrangement, column-like arrangement. Arrange panel border, so we then also create the border for our panel, and basically I'm talking about this border right here, right? So this visible border, like inset type of border, is created by saying create edged border, okay? And so it creates this border. Unless we do this, it's not created, it wouldn't be visible, but I think it's a natural choice, and a conventional type of thing to do is to indicate visually to the user that the set of radio buttons is actually belonging to a single group, and obviously using the border is one of the straightforward ways to do that. Then we say create edge border, but then we also want to combine it with this title which says color selector, and look how it's done. The border is created twice. The first time we create the edge border, the second time we create the border with the title, but to the constructor we pass the already existing border, which apparently is an immutable object, so it gets reconstructed one more time, but this time the title is added to it, and now we have both the border and the title represented by a single object, and then we tell our JPanel, take this as your border, and this is how the border is made up, right? So if you're using fancy interface of NetBeans Designer, all of this is kind of like done for you automatically, and you manipulate its properties and different settings, the information that you provide is stored in the form supplemental file that keeps the window configuration. But if you do this manually, this is how you can do this, and this is what the experience looks like, right? So there's lots of tedious code if for some reason you decided to do it by hand. Okay, so that's about it, and so we will go back to the group of the radio buttons as we, on as needed basis as we keep exploring this little application.